in the quiet hills of Natchez, Mississippi, there is a place that looks peaceful at first glance, a deep, bowl-shaped valley surrounded by trees and silence. But beneath that calm surface lies one of the darkest and least spoken chapters in American history. In 1863, as the Civil War reshaped the nation, thousands of newly freed black families searched for safety, hope, and a new beginning. Instead, many were trapped inside a hidden encampment known as the Devil's Punch Bowl, where starvation, disease, and relentless hardship claimed an estimated 20,000 lives. For generations, this story has been pushed into the shadows, barely whispered about, rarely taught, and almost never acknowledged. Yet the people who suffered there were men, women, and children who had just stepped out of bondage, believing freedom would lead them toward a better life. What they found instead was a struggle for survival so severe that history itself seemed to lose its voice. Today, we are bringing that lost story back into the light, not to reopen old wounds, but to honor the lives that were forgotten, to understand the truth that shaped a nation, and to remind ourselves why remembering matters. If you believe these hidden stories deserve to be known, if you value truth, justice, and the voices history tried to silence, then please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it so more people can learn what truly happened. Your support helps us uncover more untold history, one story at a time. For many who escaped the plantations and crossed into Union-held territory, the word freedom carried the promise of a new beginning. Yet the reality waiting for them was far more complicated than anyone imagined. As thousands of families traveled toward places like Natchez, carrying little more than hope and the clothes on their backs, they soon discovered that the end of enslavement did not mean the end of hardship. The Emancipation Proclamation had been announced with the force of a turning tide. Yet in daily life its power dissolved quickly under the weight of prejudice that lingered on every road, in every town, and even within the ranks of the very forces claiming to fight for liberty. Newly freed people walked into a world where laws were uncertain, communities were hostile, and survival depended not only on courage but on navigating a landscape shaped by resentment and fear. Families who fled toward the riverbanks believed that Union lines promised shelter, but many found themselves treated as burdens rather than citizens. In the North, they were often kept at arm's length, denied work, turned away from schools, or forced into the dirtiest jobs for the lowest pay. In the South, old resentments burned even hotter, and freedom for Black Americans felt more like a fragile idea than a lived reality. Groups who had once controlled them through force were still present in the same streets, carrying the same anger, only now confronted by the unsettling fact that the people they once owned were walking freely beside them. Even within Union camps, the promise of protection came with its own dangers. Officers and soldiers brought with them their own prejudices, their own assumptions about who deserved respect and who did not. Many freed families were placed in overcrowded settlements, given too little food and too few supplies, and were told to wait for the war to end, wait for proper housing, wait for new policies that would decide their fate. Waiting became its own kind of suffering, a slow erosion of the hope they carried with them when they first stepped off the plantations. The harshest truth was that violence did not disappear with the stroke of Lincoln's pen. It simply changed shape. Instead of overseers, freed people now faced patrols that questioned their presence in public spaces. Instead of being chained in fields, they were trapped by poverty and denied the tools to build new lives. Instead of the whip, hunger became the weapon that controlled them. And as they crowded into Natchez seeking a place to rest, the city's residents grew fearful and resentful of the rising black population. The presence of these families, tired, sick, starving, yet determined to survive, became a spark that ignited old hostilities. Slowly, forces gathered around them, deciding that the solution to this sudden influx was not compassion but confinement. The promise of freedom gave way to the reality of containment, as Union officers directed thousands of freed men, women, and children into the deep, bowl-shaped ravine that would later be known as the Devil's Punch Bowl. There, surrounded by high walls of earth and guarded by soldiers who were supposed to be their protectors, the newly freed encountered a brutal reminder that liberty without protection is little more than a fragile dream. Their struggle reveals a painful truth. Freedom in name is not the same as freedom in life. And for many in 1863, the journey out of enslavement led not into opportunity, but into a new chapter of uncertainty, danger, and profound endurance. As the Civil War raged across the country, Abraham Lincoln faced pressures that went far beyond the battlefield, pressures that reached into the very fabric of a divided nation. The Emancipation Proclamation, celebrated today as a moral turning point, was also a calculated maneuver shaped by the urgent realities of war. Lincoln understood that the Union needed every possible advantage to prevail, and he recognized the vast, untapped potential among the very people who had been enslaved for generations. By declaring freedom for those held in Confederate states, he was not only striking at the economic foundations of the rebellion, but also creating a powerful incentive for formerly enslaved men to join the Union Army, swelling its ranks with soldiers whose loyalty was fueled by the promise of a future they had never known. This strategy was not simple, nor was it universally embraced. Many in the North questioned the wisdom of enlisting black troops, doubting their ability to fight or fearing social disruption. Yet thousands answered the call, leaving behind the fields where they had once labored under whip and overseer, stepping into a war that demanded courage, resilience, and a belief in a freedom that was still only partially realized. Each enlistment carried with it a mixture of hope and risk, a willingness to fight not just for the Union but for the first real possibility of self-determination. These men, often accompanied by families who supported them, carried supplies, or fled alongside them, transformed the war into a battle not merely over territory but over the meaning of liberty itself. The proclamation's impact rippled quickly. It offered a tangible reason for thousands of African Americans to align with the Union cause. Yet it also exposed the tension between policy and practice. While soldiers marched into battle with determination, those who remained behind often found themselves subject to harsh conditions, neglect, and continued prejudice. The camps, towns, and cities that should have provided refuge sometimes became places of confinement and suffering, a cruel reminder that freedom in law did not automatically translate to safety or respect in daily life. Nevertheless, the presence of black soldiers on the battlefield reshaped the course of the war, demonstrating skill, bravery, and an unbreakable will that challenged prevailing assumptions and forced even skeptical observers to confront the humanity and potential of the formerly enslaved. Lincoln's proclamation, then, was both a moral statement and a tactical gambit, intertwining the promise of liberty with the pressing demands of war. It created a pathway for African Americans to assert agency in a world that had long denied them control over their lives. But it also revealed the gap between hope and reality, exposing the limits of freedom in a nation still grappling with the legacy of slavery. Those who marched into battle carried with them the weight of history and the hope of a new era. Yet for every victory on the field, there remained a struggle at home, a daily negotiation with prejudice, scarcity, and the unrelenting challenge of translating emancipation into meaningful, lived freedom. In examining the proclamation through this lens, it becomes clear that Lincoln's decision was as much about strategy as it was about justice, and that the bravery of black soldiers both fulfilled and complicated the promise of freedom, revealing a story that is as heroic as it is tragic, and as urgent to remember today as it was in 1863. When the cannons fell silent and the smoke of battle cleared, the promise of a new era seemed within reach for the millions of African Americans who had endured centuries of bondage. Yet the reality that awaited them was far from the freedom they had fought for and dreamed of. Reconstruction, the ambitious attempt to rebuild a nation torn apart by war, arrived like a fragile dawn, offering a glimmer of hope, yet it quickly revealed the fragility of legal and political guarantees in the face of entrenched prejudice and economic control. Newly freed families, carrying the scars of captivity and the weight of uncertainty, found themselves navigating a landscape that had been superficially altered but remained deeply hostile. While the Constitution had been amended and proclamations issued, these changes struggled to translate into meaningful, everyday liberty, and the structures of society remained aligned against them. For many, the only option for survival was sharecropping, an arrangement that promised work but often delivered an endless cycle of debt, dependence, and control. Land that had been taken from the Confederacy or left idle after the war was rented back to black families under terms that favored landlords, forcing them to surrender a substantial portion of their harvest in exchange for tools, seeds, and meager sustenance. The work was backbreaking, the margins razor-thin, and the promise of autonomy an illusion. Families labored from dawn to dusk, yet the fruit of their efforts rarely translated into real stability or security, leaving them vulnerable to eviction, violence, and exploitation. Poverty became a constant companion, and fear seeped into every corner of daily life, as those who had once been property were reminded that the social order had not truly shifted, only disguised under new laws and new titles. Beyond the economic struggles, African Americans faced social and political barriers designed to suppress their voices and restrict their participation in the public sphere. Education, voting, and representation were contested battlegrounds, as southern states imposed restrictive laws, intimidation, and outright violence to maintain the hierarchies that Reconstruction had sought to dismantle. Communities that had once been enslaved found themselves fighting not only for material survival but for recognition of their humanity, a struggle made even more acute by the pervasive resentment of white neighbors who viewed black success as a threat rather than a right. In towns and cities, the shadows of the past lingered in the form of segregated schools, limited access to basic services, and the persistent fear of attack by those who refused to accept the new social order. The victories of emancipation and the battlefield heroism of black soldiers were starkly contrasted by the grinding realities of Reconstruction, revealing that freedom was not a single moment or decree but a long, arduous process that demanded resilience, ingenuity, and courage. Even in places that were nominally safe, the struggle for dignity and self-determination never ceased, as laws alone could not erase the centuries of oppression or the social and economic structures built to sustain it. This period of Reconstruction illustrates the cruel paradox of liberation. It is possible to be free on paper yet bound in practice, and it is possible to have fought for a nation's survival without being guaranteed a place within it. The post-war years, filled with sharecropping, systemic inequality, and daily confrontation with hostility, became a test of endurance, a measure of the human spirit's capacity to persevere despite betrayal and neglect. It is in this context that the story of freed black Americans continues to unfold. A story not only of suffering but of unyielding determination to claim the freedom that was promised but never fully delivered. As word spread of the relative safety offered by Union-controlled towns, tens of thousands of freed black families began the treacherous journey southward, drawn by the hope of shelter, work, and a chance to rebuild lives long denied. They carried with them little more than their resilience, the clothes on their backs, and the unshakable belief that freedom, though fragile, was within their grasp. Yet as they arrived in places like Natchez, Mississippi, their dreams collided with a stark reality. The local population, many of whom had once claimed ownership over these same people, now looked upon them with fear, resentment, and anger, the sight of formerly enslaved men, women, and children moving freely, seeking homes and livelihoods, unsettled a society still clinging to the vestiges of the old order, and the fragile promise of post-war reconciliation began to crumble under the weight of hostility. Union commanders, caught between the obligation to protect these individuals and the mounting pressure from local citizens, made a decision that would transform hope into horror. In the deep, naturally enclosed ravine known as the Devil's Punch Bowl, they established a camp intended to confine the newly freed population, believing that containment would prevent disorder and satisfy local fears. The ravine, steep and almost inaccessible, became a place where families were forced into grueling labor, where the vulnerable children, the elderly, and the sick were left exposed to harsh weather, starvation, and disease, and where the promise of liberty was replaced by the reality of daily suffering. Walls of earth and makeshift barriers ensured that escape was nearly impossible, and for those trapped within, the very air seemed heavy with despair, echoing the cries of the countless lives that would be lost within the year. Inside the Devil's Punch Bowl, life was a constant struggle against exhaustion, hunger, and illness, and yet the human spirit persisted. Families did what they could to survive, crafting makeshift shelters, sharing meager rations, and attempting to care for one another in a place designed to strip them of agency and hope. The conditions were so severe that many prisoners reportedly pleaded to return to plantations rather than endure the camp, a heartbreaking reversal that underscored the extreme cruelty of their confinement. Disease spread rapidly through the overcrowded quarters, and corpses often remained where they fell, as the strength to bury the dead was simply beyond those still living. Each day became a test of endurance, and each loss a reminder that freedom alone could not shield them from human cruelty. Systemic neglect, or the lingering shadows of slavery. The Devil's Punch Bowl was more than a physical space. It became a symbol of the contradictions of post-war America. Here, the rhetoric of liberation and justice collided with the reality of fear, prejudice, and bureaucratic expediency, revealing the deep fissures in a society struggling to reconcile the ideals of emancipation with the persistence of hatred. The camp, with its staggering death toll and relentless hardships, forced those confined to navigate a world where safety was provisional, and freedom was a fragile, daily negotiation. The story of Natchez and the Devil's Punch Bowl stands as a testament to both the resilience of the people who survived and the profound failures of the institutions that were supposed to protect them. A reminder that the path from slavery to true liberty is rarely straight, and often strewn with trials that test the very limits of human endurance. Inside the Devil's Punch Bowl, the reality of confinement descended with a weight that few could have imagined, turning the hopes of freedom into a daily confrontation with suffering. Those who had fled plantations seeking safety were met not with protection, but with a relentless struggle for survival, as the camp itself became a crucible of deprivation and disease. Food was scarce and often insufficient, forcing families to ration what little they received, while children and the elderly bore the brunt of hunger in a cruel reminder that freedom, without sustenance, is little more than an illusion. The air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and decaying matter, a constant presence that made every breath a reminder of the fragile line between life and death. Sanitation was virtually non-existent, and the lack of clean water and proper facilities turned ordinary illness into deadly epidemics. With smallpox, dysentery, and other diseases sweeping through the camp with terrifying speed, labor, assigned to men and older children alike, was unrelenting and often beyond the limits of human endurance. Tasks designed to assert control and maintain the camp's operations left prisoners exhausted, their bodies pushed to breaking points day after day, while those who faltered risked punishment or neglect. Women, meanwhile, were left with the impossible task of caring for children, the sick, and the dying with almost no resources, while also enduring their own privations. The camp's organization, or lack thereof, compounded the suffering. Corpses were frequently left where they fell, as the strength to bury the dead had long since been drained from the living, and the unburied bodies became both a physical hazard and a psychological burden, spreading disease and deepening despair. Despite the unimaginable conditions, moments of humanity flickered among the prisoners. Families huddled together for warmth, shared morsels of food when possible, and whispered stories of the lives they hoped to reclaim once the war ended. Yet these acts of care were dwarfed by the overwhelming scale of suffering. Each day in the Devil's Punch Bowl was a test of endurance, a negotiation with hunger, fatigue, and the constant presence of death. The toll was staggering, with tens of thousands estimated to have perished within a single year, and the camp's harsh reality starkly contrasted with the promise of emancipation that had drawn them to Union lines in the first place. The camp's catastrophic conditions reflect more than mere neglect. They reveal the profound failure of those entrusted with protecting freedom to translate legal declarations into lived reality. The people who had fought for their liberty, who had survived enslavement, and who had crossed treacherous miles seeking safety, found themselves subjected to a new form of oppression, one enforced by the very system that claimed to defend them: disease, starvation, overwork, and the constant presence of death created a relentless environment in which hope and despair were inseparably intertwined, and the struggle for survival became an almost spiritual endurance, a test of resilience in the face of systemic failure. Looking back on the Devil's Punch Bowl, it is impossible to separate the physical suffering from its symbolic weight. Here was a place where the promise of freedom collided violently with the reality of prejudice, neglect, and human cruelty, leaving a mark on history that is both haunting and essential to remember. The catastrophic conditions serve as a stark reminder that liberty, when not accompanied by care, protection, and genuine opportunity, can be as fragile as it is vital, and that the stories of those who endured such suffering are crucial to understanding the true cost of America's struggle to define freedom. Long after the Devil's Punch Bowl fell into obscurity, the land itself seemed to bear silent witness to the horrors that had unfolded there, revealing truths that time and human retelling had struggled to conceal. Seasonal floods along the Mississippi River would sometimes strip away layers of soil, exposing skeletal remains of those who had perished in the camp, and each discovery became a grim confirmation of what history had attempted to erase. For decades, the evidence lay hidden, yet the earth refused to forget. In quiet, haunting ways, it continued to tell the story of tens of thousands of lives ended prematurely, of bodies left unburied, and of families who had been trapped in a cycle of suffering that began with enslavement and ended with containment, starvation, and disease. These remnants, unearthed by nature itself, formed a stark bridge between past and present, reminding all who looked upon them that freedom was a promise too long denied and a cost too often ignored. Even beyond the skeletal remains, local flora seemed to carry the weight of history. Peach groves, unusually abundant in the area, grew where the soil had once been nourished in part by the bodies of the deceased. Locals spoke in hushed tones about these groves, recognizing them as a living memory of the atrocity, a quiet yet unsettling acknowledgement that the land had absorbed the suffering of the people who had perished there, to eat the fruit, some believed, was to consume a piece of the tragedy itself, a thought that kept many from harvesting the peaches even generations later. The trees stood as natural monuments, their branches heavy with fruit yet seemingly untouched, an enduring emblem of the moral and physical weight of what had occurred in that ravine. Historians and researchers who have studied the Devil's Punch Bowl draw connections between these physical traces and the historical record. noting that the combination of eyewitness accounts, archival materials, and natural evidence converges to paint a picture of unimaginable suffering. Floods revealing bones, combined with the eerily persistent groves, provide tangible proof that complements the written testimony of observers from the era, bridging the gap between narrative and reality. This convergence of evidence forces contemporary audiences to confront the reality that the lives lost were not simply numbers on a ledger or names in a forgotten file. They were human beings whose existence, labor, and death were systematically disregarded. The ongoing presence of these markers transforms the landscape into a site of memory, where nature itself intervenes to challenge erasure and denial. Each uncovered bone, each untouched peach, serves as a reminder that history, no matter how carefully rewritten or suppressed, leaves traces that endure, and that those who perished in the Devil's Punch Bowl continue to speak through the land they once inhabited. The floods, the groves, and the quiet persistence of evidence call upon us to recognize the atrocities committed, to bear witness, and to ensure that such a chapter in history is neither ignored nor repeated. In reflecting on these physical affirmations of the past, one realizes that memory is not solely preserved in books, archives, or monuments. It is also embedded in the very earth, in ways both subtle and striking. The Devil's Punch Bowl, through its revealed skeletal remains and its unharvested peach groves, stands as a haunting testament to the lives lost, to the systemic failures that allowed such suffering, and to the enduring responsibility of those who seek to understand history fully. It is an unspoken call to remember, to acknowledge, and to confront the uncomfortable truths that continue to shape our collective consciousness. As we reflect on the harrowing story of the Devil's Punch Bowl, it becomes clear that this tragedy is not an isolated incident, but part of a much larger pattern woven throughout American history, a pattern of racial violence, systemic oppression, and deliberate erasure that has silenced countless voices and obscured the full truth of what Black Americans endured. The horrors faced by those trapped in Natchez in 1863 serve as a chilling reminder that emancipation alone was never enough to guarantee true freedom or equality. Legal decrees and proclamations, no matter how bold, could not shield individuals from the prejudices, fears, and resentments that persisted in a society structured to deny them justice. The suffering of tens of thousands of lives, the unmarked graves, and the very land that seems to carry the weight of the past all point to a reality that demands our attention. The fight for liberty, recognition, and dignity is ongoing and requires more than words. It requires awareness, education, and action. History often presents itself as a narrative shaped by victors, or by those who have the power to control which stories are told. Yet, even in the shadows where atrocities like the Devil's Punch Bowl were hidden, the truth persists. Nature, through skeletal remains and enduring wild groves, and the painstaking research of historians and scholars, reminds us that these lives mattered, that their suffering cannot simply be written out of the story of a nation. Recognizing this past is not about assigning blame to the present generation, but about acknowledging the depth of injustice that has shaped society, understanding the systemic barriers that continue to affect communities today, and ensuring that history's lessons inform a more equitable future. Each story unearthed, each fact revealed, and each narrative shared contributes to a collective consciousness that refuses to forget, offering a chance for reflection, reconciliation, and meaningful change. The tragedy of the Devil's Punch Bowl is both a memorial and a warning, underscoring the importance of confronting uncomfortable truths, challenging historical erasure, and amplifying the voices of those who were silenced. By learning about these events, we honor the memory of those who suffered and died, while also recognizing the resilience and enduring spirit of the Black community, which continues to fight for justice, equality, and the dignity that was long denied. The struggles faced in the aftermath of slavery, the resilience required to survive sharecropping, systemic discrimination, and violent oppression, and the courage of those who sought freedom in the face of unimaginable hardship all remind us that the story of America is incomplete without acknowledging these truths. Thank you for taking the time to engage with this difficult but essential history. Understanding the past equips us to create a future where justice and equality are not ideals on paper but realities lived by all. If this story has moved you, inspired reflection, or deepened your understanding, please support the channel by liking, subscribing, and sharing this video with others, helping to ensure that these hidden histories are remembered and the lessons they carry continue to resonate. Together, by confronting history honestly and amplifying the voices of those who were marginalized, we take a step toward a society where every life is valued, every story is acknowledged, and the pursuit of justice is a shared responsibility.